The Crucifixion of Jesus. A medical doctor examines the death and resurrection of Christ, by Joseph W. Bergeron, M.D. Chapter 2. How we know about Jesus. His life and teachings gave rise to the largest major world religion, Christianity. But how do we know Jesus really existed? Can we be certain who wrote the biblical accounts of Jesus' life? Aren't there a lot of inconsistencies between the different accounts of Jesus' life in the Bible? Did the information about Jesus in the New Testament morph over time and become mythological? Orthodox Christianity derives its understanding of Jesus from the New Testament part of the Bible. The New Testament is a library, a collection of books and letters. The first 4 books in the New Testament are called the Gospels. They profess to be eyewitness records of Jesus' life and teachings. Can we trust the Gospels as eyewitness accounts? Since the Gospels are relied upon to understand what Jesus did and taught, the integrity of the biblical texts is critical. If we cannot establish that the Gospels are uncorrupted eyewitness testimonies, an accurate understanding of Jesus becomes difficult. However, there is considerable evidence to support that the Gospels are accurately preserved eyewitness accounts. There is also evidence outside the Bible that verifies Jesus was an influential historical figure. Evidence of the life of Jesus outside the Bible. Literary evidence exists outside the Bible confirming the historicity and influence of Jesus. Some were written by Christians. Perhaps the most interesting, however, are works of authors unfriendly to Christianity. References to Jesus and his crucifixion by those who did not revere him are perhaps the best evidence of his historicity. Pontius Pilate. Pontius Pilate was the Roman prefect presiding over Judea when Jesus was crucified. He became the pawn of Jewish leaders in their plot to kill Jesus. Pilate was manipulated into ordering Jesus to be crucified. Pontius Pilate is a known historical figure, attested to both in the Bible as well as in non-biblical sources. Physical evidence of Pontius Pilate as a historical figure was discovered in 1961. A stone bearing the Latin inscription Tiberium Pontius Pilatus, Praefectus Judea, was found in Caesarea, Israel, dating to the period of 26 to 37 AD. The stone appears to commemorate Pontius Pilate's dedication of a temple to the Emperor Tiberius. The temple was named Tiberium. The rest of the inscription, further reading Pontius Pilatus, Praefectus Judea, simply means Pontius Pilate, Prefect of Judea. Caesarea is a coastal city and was the local seat of Roman government in Israel during Jesus' time. Archived records are known to have existed in ancient Rome. Among them are the Commentarii Principis, which contained communications to the emperor from officials throughout the Roman Empire. These would have contained records of Pilate's governance in Judea. In the digital age, data lasts forever, but in Jesus' time, written documents had a shelf life and many no longer exist. The Roman Empire was an extensive and intricate political machine with a well-developed legal system. Governmental records were maintained of all regions in the empire. Day-to-day governmental records of Pilate's political career have not survived to the present time. However, there are ancient literary references to the political career of Pontius Pilate and of his sentencing Jesus to death by crucifixion. Publius Cornelius Tacitus, AD 56 to 117. Tacitus was a Roman orator and senator during the reign of Emperor Vespasian. He was also proconsul or Roman governor of Asia from AD 112 to 113. He wrote in his Annals, AD 116, a text on Roman history, that Nero blamed Christians for the Great Fire of Rome in AD 64 in order to dispel rumors that the fire had been deliberately set by Nero's operatives. This was Nero's justification for the mass persecution of Christians. Tacitus writes, "But all human efforts, all the lavish gifts of the emperor, and the propitiations of the gods did not banish the sinister belief that the conflagration was the result of an order. Consequently, to get rid of the report, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christus, Christ, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty, referring to crucifixion, during the reign, and a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world find their center and become popular. Accordingly, an arrest was first made of all who pleaded guilty. Then, upon their information, an immense multitude was convicted not so much of the crime of firing the city as of hatred against mankind. Mockery of every sort was added to their deaths. Covered with the skins of beasts, they were torn by dogs and perished, or were nailed to crosses, or were doomed to the flames and burnt, to serve as a nightly illumination when daylight had expired." End quote. Tacitus was not a Christian. He referred to Jesus Christ as Christus, Latinization of the Greek word Christ, and referred to his followers as Christians. Tacitus' knowledge of Christianity would have come from communications within the Roman government. Being a Roman of high political standing, he would have had access to legal and political records, official reports, and contemporary historical literature while preparing his own historical text, the Annals. Roman archives must have contained information on Jesus and his followers. Tacitus specifically refers to the crucifixion of Jesus by Pontius Pilate, as well as the mischievous superstition of Christians, no doubt referring to the Christian belief that Jesus resurrected from the dead after being crucified. Tacitus provides a very early attestation to the historicity of Jesus and his crucifixion by Pontius Pilate, that Christians believed Jesus had been resurrected from the dead, and that Christianity had spread rapidly through the Roman Empire. An official Roman dossier on Christianity must have been the basis for Roman perspectives on Christianity's origin, beliefs, and practices. Tacitus verifies that Jesus was crucified by Pontius Pilate, and that Christians were a hated minority. Making Christians out to be a group of eccentric religious heretics would be of particular importance in seeking to justify their brutal mass persecution. To Tacitus, as well as to other Romans, Christians would have been considered weird heretics because of their belief that Jesus had risen from the dead. Christian refusal to worship the emperor or any accepted Roman god also caused acrimony. Tacitus's pejorative reference to Jesus and his followers is compelling evidence of Jesus' historicity and influence. Justin Martyr, circa AD 100 to 165. Justin Martyr, born in Flavia Neapolis, was a second-century Gentile convert to Christianity. He was beheaded around 165 AD, rather than recant his Christian faith and worship Roman gods, hence his surname Martyr. The word apology is from the Greek word apologia, and has the archaic meaning to give a defense. The meaning in the context here is to speak in defense of the Christian faith. As a Christian apologist, Justin wrote in his first apology to the then Roman Emperor Antoninus Pius and his sons, explaining that Christianity was a fulfillment of Jewish prophecy. Justin also pointed out that Jesus' crucifixion had been foretold in Hebrew prophecy, Psalm 22:16 and 18. He appealed to Caesar, asking him to refrain from persecuting Christians. He sought to convince the emperor that Christians were model citizens and that their beliefs were valid. Justin cites a document entitled The Acts of Pontius Pilate, which appears to have been a record of Pilate's governance of Judea. He asked Caesar to look for himself in official government records to verify that Jesus was an actual historical figure who had been executed by Pontius Pilate. He pointed out that the crucifixion of the Messiah by foreigners had been foretold in Hebrew prophecy, Psalm 22:16 and 18. Jews did not use crucifixion as a method of capital punishment. Justin also noted that Jesus' reputation as a miracle worker was attested to in the Acts of Pontius Pilate. Justin wrote, "And the expression, 'They pierced my hands and my feet,' was used in reference to the nails of the cross, which were fixed in his hands and feet. And after he was crucified, they cast lots upon his vesture, and they that crucified him parted it among them. And that these things did happen, you can ascertain from the Acts of Pontius Pilate." End quote. Advising Caesar to look it up for himself would be incredibly daring, if not foolhardy, if the records did not exist, or if they were contrary to Justin's description of them. Justin was well aware that the very act of writing his first apology imperiled his own life. We must conclude that Justin, as well as Tacitus and others, were aware of governmental records entitled the Acts of Pontius Pilate and their contents. Ancient references to Jesus outside the Bible. Titus Flavius Josephus, circa AD 37 to 100. Josephus, birth name Joseph ben Mattityahu, was Jewish and initially fought against the Romans in the First Jewish-Roman War, 66 to 73 AD. He later defected and became a servant of Emperor Vespasian, who granted him freedom and Roman citizenship. Josephus was a historian and wrote several volumes of Jewish history primarily for a Roman audience. He was not a Christian. Josephus made 2 references to Jesus. Testimonium Flavianum. What is called the Testimonium Flavianum is the most famous yet controversial passage in Josephus's writings. Josephus writes, "Now there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, if it be lawful to call him a man, for he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as receive the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him both many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles. He was the Christ. And when Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men amongst us, had condemned him to the cross, those that loved him at the first did not forsake him, for he appeared to them alive again the 3rd day, as the divine prophets had foretold these and 10,000 other wonderful things concerning him, and the tribe of Christians, so named from him, are not extinct at this day." End quote. While some consider the Testimonium Flavianum authentic, it has likely been tampered with in some way. Josephus went to great lengths as a defector to curry favor with the conquering Romans, including adopting part of the name of the Emperor Vespasian, whose full name was Titus Flavius Caesar Vespasianus Augustus. It is therefore counterintuitive to believe that Josephus would have come out with such a declarative statement of Christian faith. In Josephus's time, Christians were hated and persecuted. Most scholars concur that the Testimonium Flavianum existed in some form in Josephus' original text, even though it appears to have been altered. The importance of this passage is that it points to very early non-Christian historical reference to Jesus, whatever it may have stated in its original form. Another reference by Josephus to Jesus is much more matter-of-fact and refers to the execution of James, the brother of Jesus. Josephus writes, "Festus was now dead, and Albinus, procurator of Judea after Porcius Festus, was but upon the road. So he assembled the Sanhedrin of judges, and brought before them the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ, whose name was James, and some others, or some of his companions. And when he had formed an accusation against them as breakers of the law, he delivered them to be stoned." End quote. Josephus's account of the execution by stoning of James is generally unchallenged and considered unaltered. Josephus had no sympathy for Jesus or Christians. The Testimonium Flavianum may have been altered, but Josephus' reference to the killing of Jesus' brother James is generally uncontested. The fact that these references are present at all is evidence of the historicity and influence of Jesus. Josephus' Antiquities of the Jews was written in the 13th year of the reign of Emperor Flavius Domitian, around 93 AD, and within the living memory of Jesus and his disciples. Josephus' work provides very early non-Christian literary reference to Jesus outside the Bible. Eyewitnesses. In Peter's first recorded sermon to non-Jewish listeners, he said, "We are witnesses of all the things he, Jesus, did both in Judea and in Jerusalem. They killed him by hanging him on a tree, but God raised him up on the 3rd day and caused him to be seen, not by all the people, but by us, the witnesses God had already chosen, who ate and drank with him after he rose from the dead." Acts 10:39-41. Peter stated he and other disciples were eyewitnesses of Jesus' life, teachings, death, and bodily resurrection. The value of eyewitness testimony cannot be understated. Peter further said that he, as well as the other apostles, were divinely appointed witnesses to testify about of Jesus' life, teachings, and his resurrection from the dead. Jesus had many followers, yet the Gospels describe Jesus being intentional about selecting an inner circle of 12 disciples and mentoring them closely. He then commissioned them with preaching, teaching, and the organizational leadership of the church. Jesus was not haphazard in selecting leaders for his movement. The status of the apostles and the authority of their teaching was recognized and deeply revered even by early Christians, Acts 2:42-43. Can the Gospels be traced to eyewitness authors? Testimony of apostolic and church fathers. The term church fathers refers to early Christian theologians and church leaders. They generally do not date beyond the 4th century depending on tradition. The term apostolic fathers refers to a more select group of church fathers dating to the 1st century and first half of the 2nd century. Apostolic fathers were 1 or 2 generations from Jesus' inner circle of 12 disciples. The apostolic fathers were in a position to know who wrote the Gospels. Papias, circa AD 60 to 130. Papias was bishop of Hierapolis in Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey, who lived in the generation immediately following Jesus. He was a student of the Apostle John, one of Jesus' original 12 disciples. Papias' writings have not survived, but he is quoted by other early writers. Eusebius, 260 to 340 AD, a church father, author, and historian, quoted Papias as stating that the Gospel of Mark was a transcription from Peter about the life of Jesus. Mark had been a close companion of Peter's and someone Peter referred to as a son, 1 Peter 5:13. Eusebius, quoting Papias, wrote, "Mark, having become the interpreter of Peter, wrote down accurately, though not in order, whatsoever he remembered of the things said or done by Christ. For he neither heard the Lord nor followed him, but afterward, as I said, he followed Peter, who adapted his teaching to the needs of his hearers, but with no intention of giving a connected account of the Lord's discourses, so that Mark committed no error while he thus wrote some things as he remembered them. For he was careful of one thing, not to omit any of the things which he had heard, and not to state any of them falsely." End quote. Concerning the Gospel of Matthew, Eusebius again quotes Papias, "So then Matthew wrote the oracles in the Hebrew language, and everyone interpreted them as he was able." End quote. Papias's writings provide very early documentation of the authenticity and known authorship for the Gospels of Matthew and Mark. It is thought that Matthew also wrote his Gospel in Greek to speak to a wider audience. Justin Martyr, circa AD 100 to 165. Justin Martyr gives us valuable insight into Christian worship in his time. Christian church services specifically included readings from the Memoirs of the Apostles. Justin Martyr writes, "And on the day called Sunday, all who live in cities or in the country gather together to one place, and the Memoirs of the Apostles or the writings of the prophets are read as long as time permits. Then, when the reader has ceased, the president verbally instructs and exhorts to the imitation of these good things." End quote. Justin also directly quoted the Gospel of John. "For Christ also said, Except ye be born again, ye shall not enter into the kingdom of heaven." From John 3:3, quoted from the first apology of Justin Martyr. John's Gospel must have been in Justin's possession and read during Christian meetings. We cannot be certain what Justin was referring to as the Memoirs of the Apostles, but more likely than not, he was referring to the 4 Gospels in the New Testament. Justin's reference to Memoirs of the Apostles denotes apostolic authority. Accordingly, they were used in Christian worship and revered as Scripture, just as the Old Testament prophets. Justin's writings contain literary evidence that he possessed the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and most likely the Gospel of John. Irenaeus, AD 120 to 190. Irenaeus was a church father, scholar, and apologist who was also a bishop in what is now Lyon, France. He was a student of Polycarp, who had been a student of the Apostle John, an original disciple of Jesus. The Apostle John was in a position to verify the authenticity and authorship of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. We must assume he passed that information on to Polycarp, who in turn taught Irenaeus. Irenaeus wrote, "Matthew also issued a written gospel among the Hebrews in their own dialect, while Peter and Paul were preaching at Rome, and laying the foundations of the church. After their departure, Mark, the disciple and interpreter of Peter, did also hand down to us in writing what had been preached by Peter. Luke also, the companion of Paul, recorded in a book the gospel preached by him. Afterwards John, the disciple of the Lord, who also had leaned upon his breast, did himself publish a gospel during his residence at Ephesus in Asia." End quote. It is noteworthy that Irenaeus names all the gospel authors. Luke was noted to be a close friend and travel companion of the Apostle Paul. Luke's gospel was transcribed from Paul, according to Irenaeus. Interestingly, Irenaeus tells us John wrote his gospel when living in Ephesus, Greece. The authors of the Gospels were well known in the first century and attributed the same as they are in Bibles today. Had the authorship of any of the Gospels been questionable or erroneously attributed, Papias, Irenaeus, Justin Martyr, and others would have known and rejected them. Paul's trial before the Roman Supreme Court. The Apostle Paul said his conversion to Christianity was the result of meeting the resurrected Jesus. Paul had a specific assignment: to preach about Jesus among non-Jewish people groups, Acts 9, 1-6, and Acts 26, 12-17. Paul had been a Pharisee, a Jewish religious leader, and an effective persecutor of Christians. After his meeting with Jesus, he became an outspoken and prolific advocate of Christianity. Jewish leaders hated him. Paul was arrested and held in custody in Caesarea. Jewish leaders asked Porcius Festus, Roman procurator of Judea, to send Paul to Jerusalem for trial. The Jews plotted to assassinate Paul on the way, Acts 25, 1-3. Paul, however, requested the venue of his trial be changed to Rome and specifically appealed to the court of Caesar, the highest court in the Roman Empire. Paul speaking to the Roman procurator Porcius Festus. Paul replied, "I am standing before Caesar's judgment seat where I should be tried. I have done nothing wrong to the Jews, as you also know very well. If then I am in the wrong and have done anything that deserves death, I am not trying to escape dying, but if not one of their charges against me is true, no one can hand me over to them. I appeal to Caesar." Acts 25, 10, 11. Paul was sent to the Supreme Court of Rome. In special cases, Caesar himself presided over the court. Rome had jurisdiction over a far-reaching empire and had a developed legal and court system, including courier and record-keeping capabilities. Paul was transferred to Rome under armed guard, where charges against him were to be investigated and adjudicated, Acts 27, 1-2. Documents had to be prepared and submitted to answer charges against Paul. There would have been pre-trial fact-finding efforts and required documents filed responding to questions about the charges against Paul, similar to interrogatories prior to modern court proceedings. Imprecise facts would be recognized and potentially harmful to Paul's defense. Moreover, falsifying data submitted to the Roman Supreme Court would have been hazardous, if not foolhardy, both to Paul and the preparer of such documents. Luke was a Greek physician, Christian convert, and friend of Paul's. He was part of Paul's traveling missionary team beginning with Paul's second missionary journey, Acts 16:10. Luke and Paul were seemingly inseparable. Luke stayed with Paul while he was held under house arrest in Rome and appears to have been Paul's only companion at times, 2 Timothy 4:11. Paul referred to Luke as a dear friend, Colossians 4:14. By virtue of his education, cultural background, and close association with Paul, Luke was best positioned to prepare documents for submission to the Supreme Court. Luke wrote the Gospel that bears his name as well as the Acts of the Apostles. Luke's writings comprise the largest contribution to the New Testament in terms of volume of text from a single author. Both of Luke's books were written to a Roman official named Theophilus, the precise identity of whom is lost. It is clear that Theophilus was not a Christian. The Gospel of Luke and the Acts of the Apostles appear to be a 2-volume set, addressed to Theophilus, a non-Christian Roman official. Luke's writings stand out among other entries in the New Testament in that they are not written to Christians. John Mock, in his book Paul on Trial, makes a compelling case that Luke's purpose of extensive research and chronicling the lives of Jesus and the apostles was to prepare a legal brief for Paul's trial before the Roman Supreme Court, and probably a hearing before Caesar himself. Mach concludes that Theophilus most likely held the office of cognitionibus, a special investigator who collected information in preparation for trial, and that he was likely a member of Caesar's concilium, or special advisory council. Luke seems to have gotten to know Theophilus and addressed him informally in the opening of his second document, the Acts of the Apostles, Acts 1, verse 1. Luke, having more education than most and having a Gentile perspective of Jewish tradition, would have also been an obvious choice to write Paul's legal defense for Roman readership. Luke makes the case that charges against Paul were motivated by jealousy among Jewish leaders who charged that Paul was propagating an illegal religion, religio illicita. Luke responds to these allegations by arguing that Christianity was a sect of Judaism, thus providing basis for Paul's acquittal. Judaism was a sanctioned religion in the Roman Empire and therefore permissible under Roman law. Judaism was excused from the designation of religio illicita. Luke's writing ends with Paul in prison awaiting trial, indicating Luke wrote prior to Paul's death. Luke affirms to Theophilus that he completed careful investigation of eyewitness accounts and that his written narrative of the life and teaching of Jesus was precise and verifiable. Luke's close association with Paul afforded him the opportunity to meet people who actually knew Jesus, including James, the brother of Jesus, also early disciples and church leaders. Acts 21:16-18. Luke tells Theophilus that his documents were carefully investigated and that he could rely on their accuracy. Luke wrote, "Now many have undertaken to compile an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, like the accounts passed on to us by those who were eyewitnesses and servants of the word from the beginning. So it seemed good to me as well, because I have followed all things carefully from the beginning, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know for certain the things you were taught." End quote. Luke 1:1-4. If Luke could establish that Christians were a sect within Judaism and part of a religion permitted by Rome, it would provide grounds for Paul's acquittal and possibly alleviate Roman persecution of Christians. Instead, if Christianity were viewed as a new rogue religion, accusations against Paul would be indefensible and Christians would be subject to continued persecution. Stakes were high. Luke was submitting documents to Rome's highest court. He knew that his reported facts were subject to further investigation and verification. Misleading the Roman Supreme Court would have dire consequences. Luke would have gone to great lengths to accurately document the events of Jesus' life and Paul's work as a Christian advocate. Luke's defense of Paul may have worked. There is some historical evidence that Paul was released from prison after trial, but later recalled to Rome and eventually executed. Luke stated, quote, "Many have undertaken," end quote, "to compile a record of the life of Jesus." This implies that written accounts of Jesus' life existed in addition to the New Testament Gospels. According to Luke, many of them. Luke must have collected them. Some passages in Matthew's Gospel are also found in Luke's Gospel, for example. Whatever the case, Luke wrote during a time when eyewitnesses were still living and able to verify or refute the facts. For Luke, detailed accuracy was imperative. True to his avocation as an evangelist, Luke did not miss the opportunity to provide his Roman readers a clear dissertation of the life and teachings of Jesus. Luke would have also understood the importance of his research to Christians. Luke's writings were known to early Christian leaders and circulated among churches. Luke's authorship of the Gospel of Luke and the Acts of the Apostles was well known prior to the time of Irenaeus. Furthermore, Luke's writings were considered handed down from Paul. Irenaeus considered Luke and Acts a 2-volume set. These are very early references pointing to Luke's writings being accepted with apostolic authority and having known and verified authorship. Intrinsic evidence of authenticity. In the First Jewish-Roman War, the Roman army leveled and burned the city of Jerusalem in 70 AD. Jerusalem and the temple were looted and destroyed. Yet, the siege of Jerusalem is absent from the New Testament. This is empirical evidence that the Gospels were written prior to 70 AD and within the lifetimes of the attributed authors. The Gospels contain minor variations in detail, This would be expected of individuals writing about the same events, but separated from each other by time and location. If the Gospels were identical in every detail, it would suggest collaboration. With minor variation in detail, all the Gospels report the same overarching story of Jesus' death and resurrection. This offers further empiric evidence of their authenticity. Additionally, scribal practices and textual criticism offer evidence that the Gospel manuscripts have been transmitted through time without error. The Temple in Jerusalem. The Temple in Jerusalem was the national center of Jewish faith and worship in Jesus' time. It took decades to build, John 2 verse 20, and was fully completed in AD 64. It was awe-inspiring to gaze upon. It was built of marble with a succession of terraces. Josephus likened its appearance to a snow-covered mountain. The temple was renowned for large holds of precious metals. Portions of the external facade were plated with gold. The gates were plated with gold and silver, except the most inner gate, which was plated with brass. The outward face of the front wall was covered with gold plate, which, according to Josephus, reflected the daybreak sunlight so brightly one had to turn their eyes away. To say the temple was the pride of the Jewish people would be an understatement. The temple was the paramount symbol of national identity and the center of religious life in Israel. The temple had important significance in Jesus' life. Jesus was taken there 8 days after birth to be dedicated to God by his parents. While at the temple that day, the baby Jesus was blessed by a prophet and prophetess, Luke 2:25-36. When Jesus was age 12, his parents lost track of him while traveling home after the Passover feast. Passover marked the beginning of the week-long feast of unleavened bread, collectively referred to as Passover week. Upon returning to Jerusalem to search for him, they found the young Jesus in the temple questioning members of the Sanhedrin, Luke 2:41-49. As an adult, Jesus taught in the temple, John 18 verse 20, Matthew 21 verse 23, and Mark 12 verse 35. Additionally, Jesus threw concession merchants out of the temple, John 2 verse 13-17, Matthew 21 verse 12. Jesus prophesied the siege of Jerusalem. 2 days before his execution, Jesus made a startling prediction to his disciples that Jerusalem would be surrounded by armies and destroyed. The Jews would be taken into captivity. The temple would be completely destroyed, not leaving one stone upon another, Luke 21, 5-6, and 20-24, Mark 13, 1-2, Matthew 24, 1-2. Jesus' prophecy was fulfilled in 70 AD when Jerusalem was overrun by the Roman army. Jerusalem was sacked and burned. The slaughter was relentless. Josephus was an eyewitness to the siege of Jerusalem. He wrote that so many civilians were killed that their blood stifled flames of the burning of the city. Endless killing, Josephus wrote, quote, made the whole city run down with blood to such a degree indeed that the fire of many of the houses was quenched with these men's blood, end quote. Josephus stated that 97,000 young and strong were taken away in captivity and 1.1 million civilians were killed, mostly Jerusalem residents, but also others visiting for Passover. The temple was looted and destroyed. The entire city was razed. According to Josephus, Jerusalem would have looked like a desert to anyone that had seen it previously, and new visitors to the area would not have known where the city had been. In 71 AD, the destruction of Jerusalem was celebrated in Rome with a triumphal parade displaying captives and the spoils of war. The celebration culminated in the execution of the leader of the Jewish uprising, Simon Bar Giora. The Arch of Titus, completed in AD 82, still stands depicting the spoils from the siege of Jerusalem being brought to Rome. After the siege of 70 AD, Jerusalem no longer existed as a major population center in the Middle East. Jews became a persecuted minority without a sovereign capital until Israel was re-established as a nation-state in modern times. How is it that such a horrible, cataclysmic event in Jewish history is not mentioned anywhere in the Bible? Had the Gospels been written after 70 AD, the authors surely would have mentioned it. This is empirical evidence that the Gospels were written prior to the siege of Jerusalem. It is noteworthy that the destruction of Jerusalem was the fulfillment of a prophecy from Jesus himself. Contributing authors to the New Testament would not have missed this point. It would also have been tempting for copyists to add the destruction of the temple to the Gospels as validation of Jesus' prophecy. Rather, the absence of any mention of the siege of Jerusalem or the destruction of the temple is intrinsic evidence that the Gospels were written before 70 AD, and also that the Gospel texts were not altered by copying scribes. What about variations in the Gospel accounts? The Gospels vary in detail when describing the same events in some instances. For example, John's Gospel states, Mary Magdalene went to Jesus' tomb on Easter morning. Luke mentions Mary Magdalene and others, some of whom are unnamed. Mark names 3 women, Mary Magdalene among them, and Matthew mentions Mary Magdalene and another woman named Mary. Minor variations in the Gospel accounts, however, do not alter the overarching story of Jesus' life and teachings, yet some would take this as a point of criticism to question the validity of the Gospel accounts altogether. Such criticisms are without adequate basis, however. It would be peculiar if the Gospels were identical in every respect and did not contain some minor differences. Separate authors writing about the same events will express individual perspectives of their recollection. J. Warner Wallace, a cold case forensic detective and one-time atheist, examined the Gospels with the discipline of forensic statement analysis, as is done with testimonies collected during criminal investigations. Wallace concludes that the Gospels are consistent with separately obtained eyewitness testimonies. If the Gospels were identical in every detail, it would be suspicious of collusion or literary corruption. Instead, the minor discrepancies in story details are exactly what would be expected from different eyewitnesses separately describing the same events. What about copy errors? Imagine a world without printing presses, copy machines, or digital storage devices. Scribes were trained professionals and necessary in every aspect of life requiring a written record, from literature to legal documents. They were doubly careful when copying the Bible. Jewish scribes had a tradition of exacting precision, particularly when handling words they believed came from God. Every copy of biblical text was reviewed within 30 days, and if errors were found on 3 pages, the entire copy was discarded. In 1947, a shepherd boy found a cave west of the Dead Sea containing multiple scrolls of books from the Old Testament Hebrew Bible. The Dead Sea Scrolls date between 100 BC and 100 AD and include nearly every book from the Old Testament part of the Bible. The Dead Sea Scrolls showed very few discrepancies from the 10th century texts from which modern translations are derived. For example, the Dead Sea Scrolls included a copy of the book of Isaiah, which was written 1,000 years earlier than any manuscript which was then available. That is, the Dead Sea copy of Isaiah was a millennium older than other known Isaiah manuscripts at the time. However, the words of Isaiah are said to be word for word identical with our standard Hebrew Bible in more than 95% of the text. The 5% of variation consisted chiefly of obvious slips of the pen and variations in spelling. It is remarkable to consider that the book of Isaiah was unaltered while being passed from one generation of scribes to the next for 1,000 years. In 1970, archaeologists discovered a scroll in the Holy Ark of an ancient synagogue at En-Gedi, Israel. The scroll had been so badly charred in a fire that it could not be opened. Recently, through a complex process of computerized tomography and image reconstruction, scientists have been able to read the scroll without unrolling it. It proved to be the earliest copy of the Pentateuch, namely the first 5 books of the Bible, found in a synagogue. It dates to the 3rd or 4th century by carbon dating, possibly to the 1st or 2nd century based on paleographic indications. Like the Dead Sea Scrolls, the En-Gedi scroll is identical to the medieval texts from which most modern translations of the Old Testament Hebrew Bible are derived. It is astounding that Hebrew scribal practices were so precise that the Bible we read today is exactly the same as what was read in the En-Gedi synagogue nearly 2,000 years ago. Were early Christian scribes equally exacting when copying apostolic writings? Evidence indicates Christian scribes understood the imperative of copy accuracy. 85 to 90% of the first-century Greco-Roman world was illiterate. Yet, Christianity stands out among ancient religions for its proliferation of doctrinal literature. Christian scribes must have understood the importance of their work to the spread of Christianity and its apostolic teachings. The Bible even contains a greeting from a scribe, Tertius, the original transcriptionist for Paul's letter to the Roman churches, Numbers 16, verse 22. The spread of Christianity depended on the work of scribes. The New Testament is a library, a collection of books and letters written by the apostles to teach Christian converts. Their writings were to be copied, circulated among churches, and openly read to congregants. Paul expressly directed churches to circulate his letters for public reading. Paul addressed his Galatian letter to the churches of Galatia, Galatians 1, verse 2, expressing his directive that the letter be copied and read in the churches in that region. Paul likewise opens his letter to the Romans addressing, quote, all those loved by God in Rome, end quote, indicating that copies were to be sent to all the churches in Rome, Romans 1, verse 7. Paul's instructions to the Colossians were, quote, after you have read this letter, have it read to the church of Laodicea. In turn, read the letter from Laodicea as well, Colossians 4, verse 16. Justin Martyr noted that reading the memoirs of the apostles was an integral part of church services in his time. A telling feature of early Christian scribal tradition is the use of nomina sacra, Latin for sacred names. Nomina sacra are abbreviations used for names considered holy. Typically, they were a contraction of the revered name using the first and last letter of the name with a line over the top. Nomina sacra were most commonly substituted for the names Jesus, Christ, Lord, and God. This practice was standard protocol and is almost universally observed in early Christian texts, dating back to the earliest Greek manuscripts. Use of nomina sacra was not a space-saving tactic. Rather, it was a uniform practice pointing to a culture of quality and reverence embraced by Christian scribes. Christian scribes believed apostolic writings were holy. The ubiquitous scribal practice of incorporating nomina sacra from the earliest manuscripts onward indicates their long-standing commitment to flawless accuracy. Is Jesus misquoted in modern Bibles? Bart Ehrman's book, Misquoting Jesus, the story behind Who Changed the Bible and Why, became a New York Times bestseller. Ehrman's book title appears to have been selected for its sensationalism, which paid off commercially. Yet, the title is misleading. His premise is really not that Jesus was misquoted, rather that variations in the texts were entered and transmitted through time by copyists, eventually damaging the stories of Jesus and corrupting the basis of modern Orthodox Christian faith. As a main point, he cites two passages in the New Testament, the first being the story of Jesus writing in sand to stop a crowd from stoning to death a woman caught in adultery, John 8, 3-11, and the second being the longer version of the closing verses in Mark's Gospel, Mark 16, 9-20. These two passages are questioned by scholars as possible later additions to the texts. Additionally, he cites a handful of passages, less than 2 verses in length, in which there are differences in wording and alternate meanings in some manuscripts. These hardly support the assertion that Jesus was actually misquoted, or that the texts were altered in a way that theologically changes the Orthodox understanding of Jesus, as Ehrman proposes. Ehrman further notes that there are thousands of textual variations among early New Testament manuscripts. The thousands of variations reported by Ehrman are not disputed. New Testament copyists would either directly copy books and letters or copy by transcription during oral readings. There would have been abundant opportunity for error, misspelling, and word swapping from reading or listening errors. Does this mean the literary connection to Jesus has been lost? Daniel Wallace, a biblical scholar dedicated to the discipline of New Testament textual criticism, notes that Ehrman's observations of textual variation are correct, but they do not lead to the conclusions he proposes. Textual criticism is a centuries-old discipline of analyzing documents when the originals are not available. Biblical texts from various regions and time periods are compared, as well as references to biblical quotations by church fathers. This enables logically based textual reconstruction and validation. There are over 5,700 ancient Greek texts, with fragments dating to the 2nd century, In addition to over 20,000 ancient transcripts in other languages, there are over 1 million quotations of biblical texts by church fathers. Wallace notes there is an, quote, embarrassing, end quote, number of ancient biblical manuscripts, allowing an accurate and sound reconstruction of the originals in almost every verse. Wallace categorizes textual variations in the New Testament into 4 groups. 1. Spelling errors. 2. Variants that do not affect translation. 3. Meaningful variants that are not viable, meaning they are dismissed as inconsistent in comparisons with early texts. And 4. Meaningful and viable variants. Meaningful and viable variants do change the sense of meaning in a small number of passages, but these are rare, less than 1% of variants according to Wallace. Even so, meaningful and viable variants do not change foundational Christian beliefs. Wallace observes that Ehrman's arguments are poorly nuanced and that he selects data supportive of his opinions without providing a comprehensive treatment of the subject and leaving out data or points of view contrary to his own. To those outside the discipline of textual criticism, it is difficult to objectively filter and assess the validity of Ehrman's assertions. However, the evidence is simply not present to establish that the biblical texts have been corrupted to the point that our understanding of Jesus has been distorted. Rather, comprehensive textual criticism provides a high level of positive assurance that the accounts of Jesus' life that we have in the New Testament are intact and as written by the original authors. It is noteworthy that as earlier manuscripts of the Gospels have been discovered through time, they are found to be consistent with later texts. The earliest discovered Gospel manuscripts have failed to demonstrate wide divergence in meaning from later manuscripts. Evidence points to an accurate transmission of the Gospels to the present time. They have not been corrupted in any meaningful way since they were first written. Ehrman puts forth a straw man fallacy. He is less than comprehensive in his treatment of New Testament textual criticism, exaggerating the significance of textual variations when his actual aim is to invalidate the orthodox understanding of the life and teachings of Jesus. To be sure, the Gospels are documents of faith. Their contents will always be controversial, accepted by some and rejected by others. Ehrman's arguments, however, do not provide a reasonable basis to invalidate the biblical description of Jesus. Textual criticism has failed to establish that the biblical understanding of Jesus has been corrupted through time. Ehrman himself acquiesces that, quote, essential Christian beliefs are not affected by textual variants in the manuscript tradition of the New Testament, end quote. One may choose not to believe them, but to say the Gospels state something different than what the original authors intended is unsupportable. The bigger point is that modern translations make Ehrman's arguments mute. Ehrman's criticisms are best leveled at older printings of the King James Version of the Bible. Today, textual variations and alternate wording of select New Testament passages are recognized and well documented. There has been no attempt to keep them secret. Rather, modern translations, particularly study Bibles, have abundant footnotes pointing out alternate textual renderings. Variations identified through textual criticism have been fully incorporated into many current printings of the Bible. In summary, Jesus' life and the activity of his disciples did not occur in a vacuum. The events of Jesus' life, his crucifixion, and the testimony of his disciples were publicly well known. Jesus was a historical figure of considerable influence, well documented both inside and outside the Bible. The Gospels were written within living memory of Jesus by those who knew him best. The identities of the Gospel writers were known to 1st and 2nd century Christian leaders. The accuracy of the Gospel accounts has been protected, and their authenticity defended by scribes and Christian apologists from the very beginning. Textual criticism has failed to find egregious flaws in Gospel transmission from one generation of scribes to the next. Rather, evidence indicates that the intended meaning of the Gospel writers has been accurately preserved and repeatedly authenticated through time as earlier manuscripts have been discovered. With a reasonable degree of certainty, anyone today can pick up a modern printing of the Bible and gain a clear and accurate understanding of what Jesus' disciples saw and heard. The Gospels can be considered reliably preserved eyewitness testimony.